The story of Michael Big Mike Lerma begins in the sun-scorched streets of Pomona, California, a working-class city sitting between Los Angeles County and the Inland Empire. In the 1970s, Pomona was a place of contrasts, neat rows of suburban homes overshadowed by the creeping influence of gang culture that seeped into the neighborhoods. For a young boy like Lerma, born into a world of uncertainty and fractured opportunity, the streets weren't just a setting, they were a teacher. By the time Lerma was barely a teenager, he had already been pulled into the orbit of the Pomona 12th Street Gang, one of the oldest and most entrenched Latino street gangs in the region. The gang wasn't merely a collection of neighborhood kids. It was a social institution, complete with its own hierarchy, codes, and rituals. For boys like Mike, growing up without wealth or protection, the gang offered something the rest of the world didn't: belonging. And he was good at belonging. He was charismatic, fearless, and smart, traits that would make him dangerous as he got older. As the 1970s turned into the early 1980s, Lerma's reputation began to form. He wasn't content to be a soldier. He had ambition, a sense of order, and the kind of ruthlessness that made older members take notice. But in that world, ambition was both a weapon and a curse. At 18, Lerma committed his first murder, a gang-related killing that stunned even some of his peers. It wasn't a chaotic drive-by or a drunken fight. It was deliberate, planned, and calculated. Those close to him said it was the moment when the kid from 12th Street became Big Mike. What made his story even more ironic was that around the same time, Lerma tried to escape that life, or at least appeared to. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, hoping for a new identity. But the discipline and structure of the military clashed with the instincts he'd sharpened on the streets. Within months, his past caught up to him. When his murder conviction surfaced, Lerma was expelled from the Marines. The brief taste of legitimate authority only hardened his resentment. The world had shown him the door to a better life, and then slammed it shut. By the mid-1980s, Lerma was back in California, now a convicted murderer entering the state prison system, a brutal environment that made the streets of Pomona look tame. Inside, he found himself surrounded by hardened killers, gang leaders, and predators. It was a world divided along racial lines where survival depended on allegiance. For Latino inmates, there was only one banner that truly mattered: La M, the Mexican Mafia. To most, the Mexican Mafia was a name whispered with fear, a shadow organization that controlled life and death inside the walls. But to Lerma, it represented structure, an empire that functioned on rules, respect, and money. He began to study it, not as a follower, but as a future player. Slowly, he worked his way into their trust, starting with mundane errands, delivering messages, collecting debts, and running contraband. But Lerma's intellect set him apart. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a strategist. Other inmates noticed how he carried himself. He didn't brag, he didn't lose his temper. He learned, he listened. And when he acted, it was precise. Within a few years, Lerma had earned his reputation as someone who could be trusted to handle delicate business, to negotiate, intimidate, or eliminate problems. The Mexican Mafia valued men like that. By the late 1980s, Lerma was deeply embedded in La M's internal structure. The organization was expanding its reach, not just within prisons, but out into the neighborhoods. The street gangs of Southern California were being unified under one system of control, a tax-based empire. Each gang paid tribute to the Mexican Mafia for the right to operate, to sell drugs, and to live. Lerma saw the potential, the profit, the power, and the permanence of it all. The murders, the violence, the smuggling, All of it became secondary to control. For Lerma, control was the ultimate currency. He learned how to use information like a weapon. A whispered order could move drugs, shift alliances, or end lives. Fellow inmates described him as a man who could make silence do the talking. During brief stints of parole, Lerma returned to Pomona, and it became clear that he wasn't just another ex-con looking to re-enter society. He was returning as an emissary of La M. By then, the Pomona 12th Street gang had splintered into smaller factions, fighting for dominance. Lerma united them under a single banner, his own. Those who resisted paid a price. Violence became the message, and the message was simple. Big Mike runs Pomona. By the time he was arrested again for another murder in the late 1980s, Lerma had already become a figure of legend. He was sentenced to life in prison, a fate that would have broken most men. But for him, it was an opportunity. Prison was no longer a cage. It was an office. The concrete walls didn't stop him. They insulated him. Inside, he began laying the foundation for something larger. He organized connections across facilities, forming a network that bridged state and federal systems. He learned how to communicate without speaking, how to run business without phones, and how to enforce power without ever leaving his cell. Every order, every transaction, every murder was a move in a chess game, only he could see in full. And as the years passed, Pomona became more than just his hometown. It became his kingdom. From inside prison, Lerma ruled the streets through fear, loyalty, and precision. Those who knew him described him as a man who carried the calm of a general and the coldness of a predator. By the 2000s, he had evolved from a gang member into a crime lord, one whose influence could be felt from California's prisons to the neighborhoods where kids once threw up 12th Street signs. For Michael, Big Mike Lerma, the making was complete. The boy who once sought belonging had built a world where he was the law. The streets gave him his name. The system gave him his empire. And the prison walls, instead of ending his story, became the throne room from which he ruled. In most men, prison is meant to break the spirit. For Michael, Big Mike Lerma, it became a forge. The chaos and confinement that crushed others only sharpened his focus. By the 1990s, he had learned to turn captivity into command. Inside the cell blocks of California's toughest prisons, he began piecing together what would become one of the most efficient, inmate-run criminal enterprises in modern times. The Mexican Mafia had long operated like an invisible hand across the state, its orders passing from cell to cell through coded notes, smuggled letters, and whispered messages known as kites. But Lerma refined the system. He didn't just enforce rules, he organized them. Within years, he established his own structure inside the structure, with lieutenants, messengers, and accountants who reported directly to him. From the start, Lerma understood that power inside prison required influence outside of it. He began recruiting street soldiers from Pomona and nearby towns, creating a loyalty chain that linked gang members on the outside with inmates on the inside. When a new recruit went to prison, Lerma made sure that man knew who he answered to. When someone was released, they returned to the streets as his hands and eyes. Every shipment, every drug deal, every extortion payment flowed through his network, and a percentage flowed back to him. By the late 1990s, Lerma had established direct lines into Pomona's drug trade. Methamphetamine had become the currency of the underworld, and Lerma's organization was its banker. Through a combination of intimidation and efficiency, he centralized distribution and enforced a tax on all gang-affiliated dealers operating in his territory. The payments were small compared to the profits they generated, But refusal came with a price few were willing to pay. Violence wasn't random, it was strategic. Lerma's men used brutality to make examples, but always with his permission. Nothing happened without Big Mike's approval. Prosecutors later described his command as corporate in structure and medieval in enforcement. His operation relied on clear hierarchy and absolute loyalty. At the top was Lerma, unreachable, unseen, but omnipresent. Below him were trusted lieutenants, men who managed communications, finance, and enforcement. Beneath them were dozens of soldiers spread across California's prisons and Pomona's neighborhoods. To the untrained eye, it looked chaotic. But to those who understood Lerma's design, it was precision built for survival. Inside the walls, he developed his own brand of governance. He resolved disputes among inmates, regulated contraband prices, and even decided who could share cells. At Calipatria State Prison, where he spent several years, guards and inmates alike whispered that one wing of the facility belonged to Big Mike. It wasn't a metaphor. He controlled the drug trade, extorted weaker inmates for protection money, and used commissary networks to launder profits. Witnesses later told investigators that Lerma could have someone stabbed or spared with a single word. But what set Lerma apart from other prison shot callers wasn't just violence, it was administration. He was disciplined, calculating, and patient. He studied institutional policies, memorized guard schedules, and identified weak points in prison oversight. Using lawyers, coded phone calls, and female couriers on the outside, he created a seamless communication chain that stretched across facilities. The women, known as senoras or secretaries, were vital. They acted as his couriers, accountants, and sometimes enforcers, passing information, collecting payments, and ensuring loyalty among the ranks. Lerma trusted them more than he trusted most men. They could move through the world in ways his soldiers could not. Some smuggled contraband through visits, others maintained bank accounts to launder proceeds. They were the backbone of his empire, and many were as ruthless as their boss. By the early 2000s, Lerma's influence had reached into the federal system. Transfers between facilities only expanded his reach. Each new prison became another outpost in his growing domain. Guards described how Lerma's name carried weight even in institutions where he'd never set foot. Inmates would whisper that Big Mike said so, and that was enough to end a dispute, start a riot, or shut down an operation. In 2005, federal investigators began noticing patterns. Identical slang appearing in intercepted messages, the same accounting codes showing up in different facilities, and an unusual number of violent incidents tied to Pomona area inmates. Behind it all, they began to suspect, was Lerma. But proving it was another matter entirely. Lerma rarely spoke openly. He relied on layers of intermediaries, each only aware of their small piece of the puzzle. When one was caught, the rest remained insulated. His empire ran like a closed circuit, efficient, invisible, and impenetrable. Inmates who served time with him later described Lerma as both terrifying and oddly professional. He didn't waste words, and he never lost control. He read constantly, legal documents, criminal codes, and books on business management. One former associate told investigators, Big Mike ran prison like a CEO runs a company. He just happened to be in the murder business. Even as he consolidated his power, Lerma maintained a strict personal code. He despised unnecessary noise, both literal and metaphorical. In the noisy chaos of prison life, his silence became its own kind of authority. When he spoke, people listened. And when he gave an order, no one questioned it. In an environment built on violence, Lerma found a way to command through discipline. His control reached far beyond California. In the late 2000s, when several of his lieutenants were transferred to federal facilities, Lerma seized the opportunity to expand his reach into the Bureau of Prisons system. What started as a state-level network evolved into a multi-state operation trafficking meth, heroin, and fentanyl, all coordinated from a series of small, dimly lit prison cells. Money moved through wire transfers, prepaid debit cards, and cash couriers. Violence enforced every transaction. Young gang members in Pomona referred to Lerma as El Jefe, the boss. He dictated who could deal drugs, who could collect debts, and who had to die. Rival factions were either absorbed or erased. For years, his word shaped the criminal ecosystem of an entire city. Then, in 2020, everything changed. Inside the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles, an inmate named Steve Benkum, a small-time dealer who owed a drug debt, became the focus of Lerma's attention. According to prosecutors, Benkum's failure to pay wasn't just a financial slight. It was an act of defiance. Lerma couldn't allow it to go unanswered. Orders were passed quietly through the ranks, delivered by trusted enforcers. Carlos Popeye Gonzalez, Jose Swifty Valencia Gonzalez, and Juan Squeaks Sanchez. Within days, Benkum was dead, beaten and stabbed in a calculated attack that unfolded with military precision. The murder was over in minutes, but its message echoed across the system. No one disobeys Big Mike Lerma. What Lerma didn't realize, however, was that the same communication networks that had fueled his empire were now under surveillance. Federal agents had begun piecing together years of intercepted messages, witness statements, and financial records. The killing of Steve Benkum would become the catalyst for a federal case years in the making, one that would finally put Lerma's empire on trial. For more than 3 decades, Lerma had turned prison into a seat of power. But in the shadows of his empire, investigators were already preparing to dismantle it. The silence that had protected him for years was about to break. And when it did, the world would see just how far the reach of one man behind bars could truly go. By 2020, Big Mike Lerma had reached a level of power few inmates ever achieve. From a cell in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles, he ruled like a ghost king, invisible to the public, yet omnipresent in the criminal underworld. Decades behind bars hadn't diminished his influence. They had refined it. His word could move drugs, shift allegiances, and take lives. Inside federal walls, Lerma had built what one prosecutor would later call a government of fear. It was a quiet kind of control. There were no shouted orders, no flamboyant displays of violence. Lerma had learned that real power didn't need to roar. It whispered. His orders flowed through channels carved over decades. Coded notes, subtle nods, and carefully phrased conversations that only his inner circle could interpret. Inmates at the facility knew that if Big Mike wanted something done, it would happen, and nobody dared to question how. The drug trade inside federal prisons had evolved into a complex economy, and Lerma sat at its center. Methamphetamine and heroin flowed in through smuggled packages, corrupt staff, and visitors who were paid handsomely to take the risk. The drugs were then distributed among trusted inmates who sold them in microtransactions. A few grams here, a few grams there, at inflated prices. The profits were staggering. Money was laundered through outside associates who used prepaid debit cards, online transfers, and even cryptocurrency wallets to conceal the flow. From his small cell, Lerma managed a multi-layered operation that reached into the streets of Pomona, Riverside, and East LA. But money wasn't the only form of currency Lerma demanded. He ruled through tribute, what his organization called la quota, or the tax. Every drug dealer, every affiliated gang member in Pomona paid a cut of their earnings to the Mexican Mafia. And within that ecosystem, Lerma was the highest authority. Failing to pay wasn't just a financial offense, it was personal. It was a challenge to his legitimacy. That's how the trouble with Steve Bencomb began. Bencomb was a small-time player, a man caught between debts and desperation. Inside the Metropolitan Detention Center, he had been selling small quantities of meth on credit, hoping to pay Lerma's organization back once his outside contacts sent money. But the money never came. Weeks passed. Promises broke. In Lerma's world, excuses didn't buy time. They bought coffins. Lerma's enforcers were quick to bring the problem to him. Among them were 3 men who had long served as his instruments of enforcement. Carlos Popeye Gonzalez, known for his loyalty and explosive temper, Jose Swifty, Valencia Gonzalez, the planner and communicator, and Juan Squeaks Sanchez, a smaller, quiet man whose size belied his capacity for violence. Together they formed Lerma's inner enforcement circle, men who did the talking with their fists and knives. In February 2020, inside the high-security wing of the detention center, Lerma's decision came down like a decree. Bencomb was to be checked. In prison slang, that could mean anything from a beating to a killing. But this order came with no ambiguity. Bencomb's failure to pay was viewed as an act of betrayal, and betrayal required finality. On a quiet morning, as inmates moved between common areas, Popeye, Swifty, and Squeaks cornered Bencomb in a shower area. Witnesses would later describe the attack as surgical. It lasted less than 3 minutes. Bencomb was stabbed and beaten repeatedly, his attackers moving with chilling coordination. When guards arrived, it was already over. Bencomb's body lay motionless, the tiled walls streaked with blood, a message written in red for anyone who dared to cross Big Mike Lerma. Inside the unit, silence fell. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. The message was clear. Debts to Lerma were debts paid in blood. What Lerma didn't know was that this time, the Bureau of Prisons and the FBI had been watching. For years, investigators had been trying to crack his network. They had flipped lower-level associates, intercepted coded messages, and even traced the flow of laundered money. The Bencomb murder gave them something they hadn't had before: a body, a motive, and a direct line to Lerma's orders. Federal agents began piecing together the chain of communication. They analyzed call logs, visitor lists, and financial transactions. Messages that once seemed meaningless now fit together like pieces of a puzzle. When they intercepted correspondence between Lerma and one of his female associates referring to a payment that didn't clear and a lesson that must be taught, prosecutors saw it for what it was: a coded authorization for murders. For inmates, Lerma's grip only tightened after the killing. His reputation, already near mythical, turned godlike. Inmates whispered that he was untouchable, that even the feds couldn't touch him. Pomona gang members on the streets carried themselves differently, invoking his name with reverence and fear. Big Mike sent me became both a warning and a claim to power. Extortion payments flowed more consistently than ever. People paid not because they had to, but because they wanted to avoid becoming the next example. He was ruthless, but disciplined. To his closest circle, Lerma insisted that violence was a tool, not a pastime. He would often say, "We don't do chaos. We do control. Every murder had purpose. Every assault had meaning." He viewed himself not as a criminal, but as a ruler maintaining order in a world built on disorder. The investigation, however, was catching up. Unknown to Lerma, federal prosecutors had flipped a key witness, a courier who once moved money for his operation. She began cooperating in exchange for protection, revealing details of the communications network, the coded language, and the system of tribute that sustained his empire. What she described was staggering, an operation so organized that it had accounting ledgers, collection schedules, and punishment protocols. It wasn't just a gang, it was governance. By late 2023, federal agents moved in silence, assembling the case that would dismantle the world Lerma had built. They traced his influence across prison systems, connected him to multiple drug shipments, and secured witness testimony linking him directly to the Bencom murder. In early 2024, Lerma and several associates were indicted on charges of racketeering, drug conspiracy, and murder. Still, even behind the indictment, Lerma remained calm. During his arraignment, he stood motionless, his expression unreadable, as prosecutors described his decades-long control of Pomona's underworld. Those who knew him said he didn't flinch, not out of arrogance, but because he had always expected this day. For him, leadership and punishment were two sides of the same coin. If you built power from violence, you had to be willing to die or spend life in prison to defend it. The trial that followed would expose the inner workings of one of the most disciplined, prison-based crime networks ever seen. Witnesses described how Lerma communicated orders from solitary confinement, how his senoras moved money and messages across states, and how his soldiers carried out hits with military precision. Prosecutors called him a man who turned incarceration into command. But for those who had lived under his rule, the verdict didn't change the past. The fear he inspired lingered long after his arrest. Even as the government built its case, some inmates still refused to speak his name. They would lower their voices, referring to him only as El Viejo, the old man, as if invoking his name might somehow summon his reach. For decades, Big Mike Lerma had made silence his weapon. But now, silence was being used against him. Informants, recordings, and intercepted letters painted the picture of a man who had outsmarted the system until he finally didn't. The murder of Steve Bencom, meant to enforce loyalty, had instead shattered the illusion of invincibility that protected him for years. In the eyes of the law, Lerma had crossed a line even he couldn't erase. What began as a message to one man had become the reason his empire would crumble. And as 2025 approached, the walls that once sheltered his rule began closing in for good. By 2024, the world that Big Mike Lerma had built was beginning to collapse under its own weight. For nearly 4 decades, he had thrived in the shadows of America's prison system, turning confinement into command and transforming the Mexican Mafia's influence in Pomona into a disciplined empire of fear. But now, the silence that had once protected him was cracking open in courtrooms and interrogation rooms. The people who had once carried his messages and counted his money were now talking, and every word was another brick pulled from the foundation of his power. When Lerma appeared in federal court in Los Angeles, he looked like a man who had seen everything and feared nothing. Shackled but calm, he sat through the proceedings with the same stoic intensity that had defined him for decades. The prosecutors painted him as the embodiment of institutionalized evil, a man who could order a killing from hundreds of miles away and have it executed with precision. They described a criminal syndicate that blurred the lines between prison and street, a system so sophisticated that it mimicked corporate efficiency. Lerma's defense argued that he was a scapegoat, a convenient figurehead for a culture of violence that the prison system itself had failed to contain. They claimed the government's witnesses were liars and opportunists, inmates trading testimony for lighter sentences, women seeking protection from charges of their own. But behind the courtroom theater, the evidence was overwhelming. Years of intercepted communications, financial records, coded letters, and forensic analysis all pointed back to Lerma as the architect of the machine. The most damning testimony came from inside his own ranks. One of his closest associates, a senora who had once served as a courier, an accountant for the organization, took the stand under federal protection. She described the inner workings of Lerma's empire, how he used her to move thousands of dollars in drug proceeds each month, how he dictated orders in coded letters written on Bible pages, and how every act of violence, every tax collected, was part of a system designed for one purpose: control. Her words struck a nerve. For the first time, the invisible machinery that Lerma had built was laid bare before the public. The trial became a spectacle. Reporters crowded the courtroom, federal agents filled the benches, and former gang members whispered from the gallery as if witnessing a ghost being judged. Lerma listened to it all without visible reaction. He didn't shout, didn't deny, didn't confess. To some, he seemed resigned. To others, he seemed defiant. Either way, he understood what was happening. The system he had mastered was now dismantling him piece by piece. In March 2025, after weeks of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Lerma and 3 of his associates were found guilty on all major counts: racketeering, drug conspiracy, and the 2020 murder of Steve Benkum. The verdict carried a mandatory life sentence. In a rare moment of emotion, one of Lerma's co-defendants broke down in tears. Lerma, by contrast, only nodded once, as though he'd expected nothing less. When the judge read the sentence, calling Lerma a man who ran a government of violence, he stared straight ahead. No reaction, no remorse. To the end, he remained the same, silent, deliberate, and unmoved. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Lerma didn't look up. Those who watched from the gallery said he looked almost peaceful, as if the final act of a story he'd written decades ago was simply unfolding as it was meant to. But even behind the finality of the sentence, Lerma's legacy refused to die. In Pomona, his name still carried weight. The gangs he once commanded didn't dissolve. They adapted. New leaders rose from the ranks, invoking his name to assert their authority. Inside the prison system, the myth of Big Mike only grew. To some, he became a cautionary tale, proof of what unchecked power could do behind bars. To others, especially younger inmates looking for a sense of purpose, he became an archetype, the man who turned imprisonment into empire. Federal authorities tried to erase his influence by scattering his known associates across different facilities and monitoring communications more tightly. But history had already been written. Lerma had shown an entire generation of inmates that leadership could exist behind walls. That control didn't require freedom, only obedience. His model of organization would live on in smaller, fractured forms, each one a shadow of the machine he built. From a sociological perspective, Lerma represented a new kind of criminal evolution, the institutional gangster who viewed prison not as punishment, but as headquarters. His empire proved that the American penal system, designed to isolate, could instead incubate power. He weaponized bureaucracy, using the same systems meant to restrict him as tools for coordination and command. In that sense, Lerma wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategist, one who understood human behavior, fear, and loyalty better than most people who ever studied it formally. For investigators, his case was both a victory and a warning. They had dismantled a massive criminal network and secured one of the most significant racketeering convictions in recent history, but they had also seen how the infrastructure of modern incarceration could enable organized crime rather than contain it. One federal prosecutor, speaking anonymously to the press, summarized it best. "We took down Big Mike. But the system that created him is still here." In the months following his conviction, Lerma was transferred to a high-security federal facility, likely destined for life in a place where even communication is restricted to silence, the type of isolation reserved for the most dangerous inmates. Yet even there, whispers of his name persisted. Guards spoke of receiving letters coded in religious verses. Inmates still asked about him, wondering if he might somehow be pulling strings from the void. It's unlikely that Lerma will ever again hold the kind of command he once did. But that doesn't mean his story is over. His empire may be dismantled, but his philosophy of control, patience, structure, silence, continues to shape the underworld he left behind. The streets of Pomona still remember the order he imposed, the violence he unleashed, and the discipline that made him more than just another gang member. He was an institution within an institution, a man who redefined what power looked like when stripped of everything but will. In the end, Big Mike Lerma's rise and fall tell a story larger than one man. It's the story of how power evolves, how it adapts to walls, bars, and isolation. It's about the paradox of control in a place designed to take it away, and how one man turned punishment into empire. In 2025, as the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, the era of Big Mike officially ended. But in the mythology of California's prisons and the whispered codes of Pomona's streets, his reign continues in fragments, a legend of fear, order, and ambition. And somewhere in a cell deep within the federal system, Michael Lerma sits quietly, perhaps still thinking, still calculating, still believing that silence is power.